global community of practice that has been around for about a year now, which is really exciting. We have 320 members from around the world who are either practitioners or interested in becoming practitioners of participatory grant-making practices. And we have monthly meetings that we regularly have about 60 people attending. And those meetings, we cycle through a series of topics from deep dives into specifics around participatory grant making to peer coaching, and then also talking about advocacy and how we can further spread the practice of participatory grant making in philanthropy. So if you're interested in learning more about the community of practice, if you're not already a member, feel free to shoot me an email and I can help get you set up. We are going to be having a website soon, which we're very excited about. So, but for now, you can just contact me through my email in the chat. So yeah, this session is an extra learning session outside of our regular program, just to take a deeper dive into this topic of Indigenous-led funds and how Indigenous-led funds are using participatory grant making to center the Indigenous worldview and their practices. So I'm really excited to introduce our amazing speakers. And I'm just gonna say each their names, and then maybe each one of you can share where you're calling in from. Oh, thanks for the spotlight. Okay, so we have Mariana Lopez, who's the program director of the Pawanka Fund. And
hello to everybody, Mariana Lopez here. I'm based in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and I will be sharing about the work of Pawanka Fund, that is a global fund. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. And next I'll introduce Shelley Means, who is the coordinator of Native Voices Rising.
Hey, everyone. I'm Shelley Means, and I'm Ojibwe and Lakota, and I'm calling in here from the home territories of the Puyallup people, which is kind of near Seattle and Tacoma, Washington.
Welcome. And Pearl Gottschalk, who is with the Kindle Project, and the fund is called Indigenous Women's Flow Fund.
Good morning, relatives. My name is Pearl Gottschalk, and I'm calling in from the Penticton Indian Band land up here in the Salmon Nation, known as British Columbia, Canada. Welcome.
Thank you all for joining us. I'm so excited to dive into this topic. So I'm just gonna I have a few questions I'm gonna ask the speakers to reflect on, and then at the end we are gonna save some time for a Q&A. So please collect your questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we can keep an eye on those throughout our time together today. So yes, my first question to you all is, what are some of the barriers for Indigenous communities participating in traditional philanthropy? And then on top of that, how does your organization or the structure that you use address some of those barriers? And Mariana, would you like to share first?
Yes, sure. I would like to share about the barriers because Pawanka Fund was born in September of 2014 in the context of the United Nations Conference on Indigenous Peoples, and exactly was created as an Indigenous-led fund to change the way grant making is done, and exactly to face those barriers that we were experiencing and found in the traditional philanthropy. So we can identify different kind of barriers to participate in, and we can say that all of them are linked to the traditional asymmetric power relationship that have been reproduced for years in the traditional philanthropy. So in general, donors have been traditionally non-Indigenous organizations that support Indigenous peoples as beneficiaries or as receivers of help. So this is, I think that this conception is the first barrier that we are trying to face with the creation of Pawanka. In those relationships, indigenous peoples are not recognized as indigenous holders or as experts of their own community. In general, external technicians are the ones who develop the proposals and led the implementation of the initiatives, leaving maybe indigenous peoples just for logistical coordination, no? And so this conception is the barrier that we are facing and we are trying to change. For example, in traditional philanthropy, organizations are selected by the technical level of their proposal, or maybe by the donor records. I remember working in other organizations, and the first question of donors when they want to support you is, okay, please send me your donor records. So I was always thinking, okay, how we are going to access to funding if it's the first time that we are approaching, the donor community. So all these practices and conceptions are we trying to face. Another barrier that we identify is the issue of the language and the concept of the monitoring and evaluation of the process of project implementation. For example, many indigenous peoples communities, they don't share the same language of the donors and the same concept of monitoring and evaluation. So maybe the format, the time frame of implementation are very different, and this make maybe difficulties to really build a relationship between indigenous communities, indigenous organizations, and the donor community. So how Pawanka try to deal with these barriers. Pawanka is an initiative, as I say, that is a new initiative because we have just 5 years, and we are trying to build our model based on relationship, based on trust and mutual trust between Pawanka Fund and our partners. So the organization that we are supporting are not grantees or beneficiary. For us, are partners, and we are building together the relationship. So in that way, we are trying to change this asymmetric power relationship that we have experienced and lived for many years. And so a concrete strategy that we are developing to build this kind of relationship is a process called the cultural due diligence that is developing Pawanka Fund. And the cultural due diligence is based on this, in the social recognition that indigenous organizations and traditional have with one another, that rather than on legal or administrative criteria. So when the guiding committee of Pawanka, composed by indigenous leaders from different parts of the world, select the partners, which one we are going to work, they base their selection on the cultural due diligence. And the cultural due diligence is composed by 8 cultural criteria that are at the beginning of the process of the relationship, building the relation with the partners, and accompany us in all the process of the implementation and finalization of the project. So this cultural due diligence has 8 cultural criteria that I can mention the criteria. They are the well-being and self-determination, the equality between men and women, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the partnership and networking, the traditional knowledge, the system of learning and knowing, Mother Earth, and the cultural practices and spirituality. So the process of cultural due diligence is the one that the guiding committee of Pawanka start and share among themselves how this organization is contributing and is working on these 8 cultural criteria. So we think that starting the relationship based on cultural and social and recognition and trust is a way to start changing this power relationship that we can see in the traditional philanthropy. So I live here, and we can continue in the next question.
Thank you, Mariana. And next I'll invite Pearl to speak.
Thank you, Mariana. Yeah, I'm joining you, speaking on behalf of the Kindle Project, and we are an intermediary that works in creative grant making, creative and participatory grant making with both donors and communities. So we're a really out of the box organization set up in 2008 that's kind of set up to really break the status quo of traditional philanthropy. So that's why we love this question about barriers. And I'm hoping to maybe build on a few things that my colleague talked about, Mariana just mentioned in her presentation as well. There's a few key barriers that we kind of see in modern philanthropy that me and my colleague Sadaf, who is also on the call, identified, and also that Indigenous people have identified to me in over the last few decades of working in Indigenous-led funding as being the main issues that they see, and that participatory grant making can really help us to break down. 2 of them being what I call the administration mountain, and Mariana talked about this a bit, and the other one being what I call this kind of access to resources barrier, which I kind of call the VIP social club. So first, talking about the administration mountain, we see this a lot in our work on the ground, and especially with Kindle. It's this concept that we're going to bury our grantees in modern philanthropy. We kind of bury our grantees under a mountain of administration, be it paperwork, applications, then the barriers that Mariana mentioned, like language and access to even being online, and reports. So it's very cumbersome. And I guess it requires us to take a step back as grant makers and think, is this really the way to get to the systems change that we want to see? And what of this is really important to us, and what can we do away with? And so at Kindle Project, we're trying to use our imaginations to be as creative as possible to see how we can better shift that mountain and actually instead create a way of honoring the ways of Indigenous people have always had as gifters and givers, and to also align our worldview with theirs. So some of the ways in which we do that, we kind of help to build bridges between donors and our Indigenous cohort. So how our grant making system works within our flow funding system that we use at the Kindle Project is we're basically creating a system where Indigenous people have chosen other Indigenous women. We have a cohort of 5 of them. And then we all sit together at a table. And at this table, we all share the banquet of resources with both our fiscal sponsors, our intermediaries, which would be like the Kindle in the role, as well as our donors, and then our 5 Indigenous cohort. So Kindle Project really holds this scaffolding and says, okay, how can we look at the major barriers, one of those being the administration? How can we do away with things that we don't necessarily need to hang on to? Do we really need all these cumbersome reports and applications? And if not, how can we navigate around that? So Kindle uses our extra time and resources and our connections and our ability to empower and work with Indigenous women, especially on the ground. This is an Indigenous Women's Flow Fund. To seeing how we can get around the major barrier, especially for Indigenous communities, being that of fiscal sponsorship. As we've all seen many times, we have great groups doing great things on the ground, but they're following their, perhaps in their communities, they don't have that same worldview of following tax law as the be all end all to make systems change in the world. Often these communities are following their own ideas of traditional law And for us, that's kind of looks like, well, then how do we as philanthropists say, instead of you fitting into our box over here of what we think as experts in grant making to make change, saying, well, how have you been traditionally gifting in your communities for thousands of years? How can we learn from that and honor that? So that's a part of our whole mission, is to create spaces where we can both learn and grow from each other, share our learnings, and step back and say, we don't actually know the best way to give money and to move resources. So instead, we're going to sit back and listen to how Indigenous people have been doing this for thousands of years, and allow a space that might be a bit of a messy middle space as we're walking towards each other, building bridges. But we're going to use this space to really listen and create extraordinary ways of doing grant making that maybe have not been done before. So that kind of leads me into the idea here that there is this sort of major access to funders. And that funders, as we often know, that's very much every time you go as a grant seeker to get a grant, there's a invite only barrier. There's we only deal with we fund based on relationships, right? So how do Indigenous peoples and communities get cross that barrier, that divide of even knowing or being in front of a donor? And that whole space is kind of, it's a disempowering, disenfranchising, re-traumatizing system that's been set up for Indigenous peoples to access funding. So one of the ways at Kindle that we are navigating that is we are creating something like a banquet table with all of our resources set together, and we're all equitably invited to the table to share and to decide how to divide those resources, how to share that, but also as donors to step back, recognize our ego as experts, and instead our Indigenous women as leaders and as experts in this field, that they might know best how to bridge these divides, and also how to use flow funding and the resources rather than being extractive and re-traumatizing, to say, we have been in the community for dozens of years. We know everybody, we know your children, we know all the work, we have been watching it for many years. So when we come to you and say we are giving you a grant, it's an honor system that says, we see the work that you've been doing. Our donors back us. We don't come here saying that you need to prove to us that you deserve the resources, but instead saying that we have seen the good work that you've been doing, we honor it, and we want to really validate that. So that's really important for us at Kindle, is that we don't say that, we don't step back in our ivory tower and say, okay, Indigenous communities and people need to find us and need to beg at the table, but instead saying we're all going to come together and share and relinquish control. And listening means relinquishing control. So a lot of reduce these barriers is a lot deepening, which can be challenging, but also really fun, and opened up amazing, extraordinary new possibilities for grant making that our Indigenous women have come up with that we never could have thought of as experts in the field. So thank you very much. Those are just a few of the barriers that we see daily in our field.
Thank you, Pearl. And Shelley, I'd love to invite you to speak next.
Thank you. Thank you, Pearl and Mariana. I think you've just wrapped it up. There you go. No, I'm kidding. So barriers. I think I want to invite everybody to kind of step back for a second and think about what Mariana and Pearl have just been talking about. Because I guess I'm seeing some circles here that I'm going to use to frame my response to these questions. There's one circle, which is community wisdom. People in our communities have the answers but we just don't have the resources often. Philanthropy is an institution that also has wisdom, that also has but has the resources, and those resources grew and are sheltered under tax laws at the expense of this community with our wisdom to solve our own solutions. And by the way, this model of these two circles and where they overlap being the sweet spot where we're working right now. That model is from an organization I've learned about from an organization in Minnesota called the Cultural, oh my gosh, I'm blanking out on the name, Cultural.
Survival?
No, Cultural, oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to look that up and get it in the chat. I'm so sorry. But basically the sweet spot here is where I believe NVR sits and takes community wisdom, works with community wisdom to change grant making so that resources are going to the people in community who have the solutions. So Native Voices Rising is a pooled fund, and it began back in 2013. And I want to lift up the two visionary, beautiful people who envisioned this. One would be Ron Rowell, who at the time was executive director at Common Council Foundation, and in collaboration with Native Americans in Philanthropy, where at the time he was serving as president of the board of directors. And then Carly Hare was the executive director at Native Americans in Philanthropy, and she and Ron put their heads together with other board members and other people from the community and said, we're done with philanthropy not seeing us. We know that less than 0.3% of philanthropic dollars in this country go to Native communities. And here's a barrier that I want to lift up. The barrier that they saw was that that data of that very small number of resources going to Native communities came from the Council on Foundations report. Is that right? Allistair, I think that's correct, saying, which was looking at large grants, like really large grants, and we're including large grants that were going to museums and universities, et cetera. So to other large institutions, not into community. And so, so the first thing that happened was just a report saying, these are the barriers, here are some recommendations, philanthropy. The resources need to go into community. Because it's Common Council and because it's Native Americans in Philanthropy, it was also very much mindful that it's grassroots people. You know, there's not going to be this equal sort of institution that philanthropy can then, you know, flow the resources into. That really needs to flow into community. So I guess the second barrier in that context I would lift up is worldview. Okay, so the extractive industries, the families that have their fortunes from the money they've made off the land that was Indian land that was taken, that part of this country's history stems from a worldview of manifest destiny, of capitalism. The worldview of the communities that were impacted is vastly different. It's more of the circle that I'm talking about. It's taking what you've learned from your ancestors, being accountable to your ancestors, being accountable to the future generations, seeing the world as a place of all living things and not just the human beings, and that we need money to do our work. You know, I'm quickly running to the end of my time, but I think what I want to do is just for a second run through the structure that NVR has to address these huge barriers, because I think they're barriers that also have some huge opportunities through participatory grant making. So we operate with review committees that are made up of community members who may or may not work in a nonprofit context, but who have the wisdom to know what leadership looks like from the Indigenous worldview, and who know what solutions and community involvement, community engagement for social change, know what that looks like. They're the ones that make the recommendations. They're the ones who who do the work, the work of looking at every proposal. And, we tried to streamline, we addressed this barrier, the administrative mountain that Pearl talked about, by really asking people to tell their story, not measure this and think this way that philanthropy thinks, but to really just say, this is the work. This is how we engage our people. This is, and most importantly, Native Voices Rising is all about general operating dollars. We don't do restricted funding. I think I'm going to go ahead and just pause there and turn it back to Kelley.
Oh, thank you. I almost want to just take a pause just because there was so much amazing information shared, and I'm just taking that all in. Yeah, thank you all so much for sharing all of your thoughts with us today. I'm going to go to the second question, and hopefully this will just build on everything that we've shared so far. So our second question that we have for each of you is, how are Indigenous-led funds working to build a new model of philanthropy? And I think some of you have started to touch on this, and so excited to just give each of you a little bit more time to share specifics about the different ways your funds are remaking philanthropy with an Indigenous worldview. So Shelley, I'm actually going to have you go first this time so you can keep sharing about your project.
Thank you. Great. So yesterday, Native Voices Rising hosted a webinar for our grant partners. And one of the speakers yesterday said, sort of reflecting on philanthropy, that philanthropy is its own culture and has its own language. And that's often, I guess maybe I would lift that up as an additional barrier, because I think it's very true. So, when we talk about how we're building, or we're working to build a new model, I look at our partners with NVR. Common Council Foundation does the bulk of the fundraising for Native Voices Rising. And I think that is such a gift to this pooled fund, because they know the culture, or they speak the language of philanthropy in a way that that the grassroots folks engaged in this project aren't expected to do. We don't have to step into that culture as much. We get to operate from. Let's see. We've in the past, we have the experience that I know I've had in the nonprofit world approaching philanthropy is always being expected to speak from a place of scarcity, to say, here's my disproportional impact of this, and here's the the negative glimpse of what poverty looks like in my community, and here's the long difficult history, which is all true. There's a long difficult history, and but instead we get to stay in our worldview and in our cultural perspective that the world is an abundant place. I mean, the longer I'm exposed to the world of philanthropy, the more I see how many dollars are actually residing there, how many resources, how many really brilliant people also work in philanthropy. And I think, wow, more of us should know about that. More of us should have access to that, because that's where change in this world is going to happen. I think NVR isn't the only Native-led philanthropy. Obviously, there's two examples, Pearl and Mariana, the work they're doing. There's Potlatch Fund, and the name Potlatch is about, this comes from a cultural ethic of those who have the most resources have an obligation, like a moral, ethical obligation to to give everything back to community. And I think what's happening, Na'ilahi Fund, there are so many out there, in Indian Collective, and we're really kind of building some momentum of, if you want to find the experts in solving what needs to be solved and resourcing what needs to be resourced in our communities, you need to rely on our communities to make those decisions and to do that giving, because they're our relatives. We know how to take care of our relatives. I'll just say one of our grant partners with NBR is my friend Colleen Echohawk's organization, which is the Chief Seattle Club here in Seattle. And I remember her turning to a funder one time, and it was about Gates Foundation grants, re-granting, and she looked at him and said, we don't think the large institutions that you're going to be funding see us. If you really want Native homelessness to end, then put Native people in charge of ending it, and argued that they flip their equation and that the bulk of that funding would go into Native communities. And she's on fire. That's really happening here in Seattle. And I also want to lift her up really quickly, because not her, but Chief Seattle Club up, because that was an organization that does direct services, and they could not get funding to do advocacy work, but NVR provided funding for advocacy work because it was general operating dollars, and it has empowered her organization to change the world of what homelessness looks like in this region. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. And Pearl, would you like to share more?
Sure. Thank you, Shelley. That was so beautiful, what you said. And the interesting part about our work at Kindle is that we are a bit of a hybrid. So we are a technically non-native intermediary. And what we do is we hold the scaffolding, or we kind of hold the container in a partnership with donors and with our Indigenous women cohort. So we hold all the intermediary stuff as well with the support of CCF. And so what that does is it's not technically an Indigenous-led fund. But what we're doing is we're providing and taking away a lot of the extraneous work of the administration mountain, so that our Indigenous women can really run with and do the important work that they need to do and focus on that. And so for us, this new model of philanthropy really looks like a beautiful space that is being shaped and defined by our Indigenous women as leaders. And they have said it themselves many times that we have been the traditional caretakers of our communities, and we want to be given the honor and recognition as having done that. Being life givers as well. So how can we really support Indigenous women to be the change makers that we want to see? What is our role in that? So that's how we are looking at being adventurous and totally smashing the typical system of doing everything and flipping it on its head and seeing how we can change that. So one of the ways that we do that is by kind of changing the honor system, I kind of call it, or that's the way I think of it. We see, of course, our Indigenous women as experts, but we really honor not just them, but also the ways of being and knowing, Indigenous ways of being and knowing as extremely valid, and as the way that can lead the future of philanthropy, rather than us continuing to lead the future of philanthropy with our own new models that we come up with in our heads. But now this is a joint collaboration, whilst honoring that and the role that it deserves. And we are constantly coming up with the issue of how much do we lead? How much do we follow? And it kind of reminded me of, as a dancer, I think about when you're doing a partner dance, it's often complex and complicated for us to know each other's beats. It's hard for us to know the steps. We're learning the new ways of moving together, and we're also stepping on each other's toes a lot. And it happens, and there's ouches and there's challenges in this new way that we're trying to build a new model of philanthropy. But we accept that that's always going to happen when we learn something new. So that requires a lot of courage on behalf of our donors, who stand behind us and they say, okay, there's going to be some oops and ouches, and there's going to be some stepping on each other's toes, but we're willing and we're brave, and we're willing to stand behind whatever happens. And that requires a huge shift in the mentality for our donors and for people who are really willing to step up and say, okay, we're really ready to put our money where our mouth is, and really stand behind this new system that we want to see. So we actually create this space within our calls that we have and with our grant making for our Indigenous women to talk about how they want to, I guess, decolonize or re-indigenize and rematriate the system of giving. And for them, it's looked like them slowing the process down, thinking of things circular, in a circular way, in a seasonal way. And they do their giving in a way that's ceremonial. They're continually asking that we could just step back, that we could pray, that we could bring in our ancestors, our plant ancestors, bringing in the more than human world, our animals, our relatives. How do we operate on the cycles of the moon, those cycles of seeds? This is a new concept to us in philanthropy. Those of us who have been doing grant making for a long time, we're probably not used to thinking of things in this way. And it's really exciting, and it's really empowering. And it recognizes that if we want to really truly do the healing work that can be done through systems of giving and through philanthropy, we really first have to look at the ways in which our system re-traumatizes, and the way in which we can recenter Indigenous ways of being and knowing as the leader. And that's flowing through our women. And so we're really looking at a new model of equity rather than tokenizing. And so the women who come into our circle are very well compensated for their time. They do not come seeking more resources or needing to do any of that extra work that we talked about in the first part, but they're in positions of serious leadership and decision-making. So I think in this new equitable world of philanthropy, we would really love to see Indigenous people as leaders in organizations, not just there to fill the role as the Indigenous person, but for us in the roles as grant makers and donors to really think about how do we consider putting Indigenous people into a system that can be re-traumatizing for them. And so at the same time, how do we hold a container that's really safe for them as well to participate? Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Pearl.
Thank you very much, Shelley and Pearl. I really like how you express our intentions. I think that we share a lot of things. And also for us, as Pearl mentioned, has been a very learning process, how to do it. We have not started Pawanka from the beginning, having all the answers on how to build an Indigenous-led fund. So we really have been learning by doing, and we are, testing and trying different strategies to be as active as possible. And this is a process, so it's not something that we have from the beginning, from the first day. It's something that we are building, this Indigenous-led fund. And the most important thing that I want to highlight, that building an Indigenous-led fund is a collective process. And I think that this is also a difference from maybe other initiatives in a traditional philanthropic conception, because an Indigenous-led fund is a collective process. And of course, to be a collective process, that means taking more time maybe. And the time is also an important issue here, the different conception of time that the Indigenous community have if we compare with some others, maybe the Occidental worldview. So in Pawanka, we are building this process, and our conception is that we accompany the local indigenous communities in different parts of the world with different backgrounds, with living in different ecosystems. So we accompany the partners in different parts in their process of empowerment. So this is something that also we are trying to change. It's not Pawanka Fund that empower communities. We are just facilitating resources and to allow or to accompany the indigenous communities in the ground in their self-empowerment process. So we facilitate not just financial resources, but other kind of very important resources as the process of mentorship that we have between indigenous leaders from our guiding committee with the local partners in the process of developing their applications, for example. The building of alliances between the local level and the indigenous international movement. This is also something that we work on, and we work to build this link between the local indigenous communities and the international movement. We promote all the peer-to-peer knowledge exchange and sharing. Sometimes we ask somebody, ask us about the capacity building and say, okay, I agree with the capacity building process that is usually done by many organizations. And we say, okay, we prefer to facilitate, peer-to-peer exchange, recognizing the wisdom of this local organization and how they can exchange and be empowered, from themselves, and supporting and building solidarity and alliances with other indigenous organizations. And another strategy that we are implementing is the advocacy in different philanthropy spaces on showing how it's possible with concrete example, how it's possible to change the philanthropy. So we participate as Pawanka Fund and in cooperation with other Indigenous-Led funds, we participate in different funders networks to share our experience, to learn, and also to exchange the knowledge that we are gaining, during this year. And in this sense, we are also participating in some international platform as the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues that is this week, and the next week is the Permanent Forum. And we want also to facilitate visibility to the role of Indigenous-Led fund at international level. So we organize some meetings. I will send the information in the chat so you can also join these events. The objective is to try to achieve the recognition of Indigenous-Led fund as a practice, a good practices for the self-determination of indigenous people, and the possibility that the community expand the access to funding through the Indigenous-Led fund. So I want to finish here and have time for the questions.
Thank you so much. Oh, so much information, and I see a lot of questions already coming up in the chat. Allistair, do you want to take it from here and work through these questions?
Yeah, I'm wondering, because there's a question as well that kind of goes along with this last question that was posed to the panelists, and it's what helps you kind of stay in this way of thinking and not cede ground to the worldview of traditional philanthropy. And so wondering if folks want to just chime in on that piece, and then there's a lot of other questions that we can go through too.
I'm happy to answer quickly. I just spend as much time in community as I can, and in ceremony, because that I feel kind of wraps a blanket around me to remind me sort of who I am and how I need to walk into this world of philanthropy.
I can also speak up there and say, thank you, Shelley, exactly that. Having staff, and also we have an Indigenous facilitator, but also having staff that is really also grounded from a way of life. They bring this way of life as well, whether being Indigenous or not, they kind of have this idea of living in this other way of knowing and being is really key. So we do have an Indigenous facilitator who helps to maintain that space. And also we are very just self-aware when we see this arising of wanting to slip back into that way of thinking, to just to be very reflective and to continually bring it back and kind of check in with ourselves.
Well, I want to add the case of Pawanka. Pawanka has a guiding committee composed by 10 Indigenous leaders from different parts of the world, and are the one that really connect Pawanka Fund with the communities in the different regions. They are part of the communities, so they are keeping this link with the community and bring the knowledge from the different Indigenous organizations in the ground to all the planning and everything that Pawanka decide. So I think that this link is so important, and sometimes people maybe also ask about, but why are not you having open calls like others organization to fund communities or organization? And we stress the importance to have this cultural and social endorsement and connection with the organization or communities in the different parts. So this is key because we want to build this trust relationship.
You all. So I'll just throw out a slew of questions and you all can respond to whichever ones make the most sense or resonate with you all. So one is around, how do you solve for resistance to taking philanthropic dollars? Another one is around just asking around if you could say more around the decision making and processes around your particular participatory grant making vehicles. And then one is around the context of having a participatory program and wondering and comparing that to mainstream philanthropy. So or do you have any just lessons for folks around? And I apologize, I think I'm butchering this last question, Grace. But do you have any lessons to share around how just the intersection between those two, like participatory grant making and regular philanthropy? And Grace, feel free to chime in and reframe that question.
I'm not sure I said it any better than you.
Or if none of those questions resonate with y'all, feel free to ask your own question and answer it.
Well, sorry, yes, please.
can just jump in and speak to the issue around decision making, because I really appreciate webinars where I get some really practical skills where I can leave with and implement. And so for us, we have two ways. We have an individual flow fund and a collective one. And the individual, we honor their autonomy and self-determination as long as they fall within the rules and the guidelines of our fiscal sponsor. And for the collective one, we've had to make a group decision-making process. And that has been really learning for us. There actually has been no way and no one model that we can say or implement. It's different, and it actually honors the dynamic of our circle and of our women and how they want to make that decision. And it's been unlike any other decision-making process we've ever seen. Technically, we throw out the idea of consensus, but they actually wanted to step back and do it in a ceremonial and prayer-based way. And it ended up taking longer. And this is really important for us. I love how Sadaf says we move at the speed of trust. And really that means that we're going to move slow if they need to move slow, and really back it all down and slow it all down and move in the way that they want to, and make the decisions at the pace that they want to and in the way that they want to, while at the same time honoring the fact that we have a deadline. We do need to move grant money by this time. So it's really, like I said, it's like that dance. So you really kind of have to be open to really listening, some deep listening, at the same time holding true to the maybe the philanthropic guidelines that you still, the scaffolding you still have to hold. So I don't know if that's applicable to all circles, but that's just how we've done it at Kindle.
Yes, I like the way that you share about the decision makers. I think that Pawanka will share many of these kind of strategy and how time is an issue. But I would like to just to share a concrete action that we have regarding how we combine, different systems that we need to combine. It's not something that we can really do whatever we would like to do. In some points, we need also to make, combination of systems in some way. So in the case of Pawanka, as I mentioned, this cultural due diligence and the relationship of trust that the guiding committee has with the organization that they are, recommending and endorse. This is the first step, for the relationship with the organization. But after that, we have also a process of, the traditional administrative and legal also due diligence, because we need to make an agreement and we need to have this legal security in some way. And we are working with organizations from different parts of the world, and we have many challenges. For example, in our partners in Russia, they have many challenges to receive the funds, and the same with Bangladesh and other countries. So we try to see in each case what is the best option for the organization to receive their own funding. We try to, we try to do our efforts to direct the organization, trying to avoid intermediate organization. But in some cases, we need to use, intermediate organization as fiscal sponsor. So this is a combination, and it's case by case that we analyze, and we support the organization also to have their legal documentation, maybe translated into English because they need it in English, and many things. So we also support this process, as we think that it's important to be prepared to receive funding from different sources.
So I could say a few words. I see we're running really close to time, but I wanted to just quickly say that the decisions for Native Voices Rising are made by the grant committees. We call it the art and science of grant making. So we have a scoring sheet that each of them individually work with as reviewers, and then we bring them together to look at the combined scores that they've given to the proposals that we're considering. And then we have a facilitated process that Carly Hare leads us through that is, gives people a chance to lift up what they were excited about with a particular group, or what further questions they might have about a group. And get everybody kind of settled into this sort of palette of groups under consideration. And then they work on like allocating a pool of, or a pot of money to these groups. So, and where they land, we give them, you know, all the opportunity to interact with each other and share their wisdom about, you know, what is strong about certain things and what allocations. They make the decisions. And then I saw this last question that I think is super important. What 2 pieces of advice would you give to Indigenous-led funds that are just starting, or participatory funds that are just starting? And I would say from my experience with Native Voices Rising is, and also sort of connecting to that sweet spot I was talking about, which by the way was from the Cultural Wellness Center, and I'm going to put them in the chat. That sweet spot of community and institution, it's so important to have somebody to help translate the culture for your Indigenous participatory fund. You know, find the strong allies that can step with that open mind, open heart, and shared learning kind of space. So thank you.
So I know we're at time, so want to just appreciate and thank all of our presenters. So thank you. Want to thank Connor Cross, who has been doing the tech and behind the scenes stuff that no one notices, but really appreciate it. And then Hannah threw in the link to join their PGM community if you're interested in that. And all the contact information will be shared out, but just want to thank everybody for their time, and thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.